Japan Station is made possible in part by Patreon support. If you would like to make sure that I can keep bringing you more content like this, then head on over to japankyo.com/Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Welcome to Japan Station. I'm your host, Tony Vega. All right, so let's just get right into it. My guest today is the chair of modern Japan studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She is an expert on food history in Japan. Her name is Dr. Katarzyna Cwiertka. And recently, she published a book that she wrote along with Miho Yasuhara called Branding Japanese Food, From Meibutsu to Washoku. So I came across this book a few months ago. Actually, I got an email from one of the many email lists that I'm on announcing a online lecture given by Dr. Cwiertka, and it was about the research that she had done to publish this book. And it sounded really interesting, so I checked it out and I was blown away. So, as you may be aware, in 2013, UNESCO designated washoku as Intangible Cultural Heritage of Japan. And washoku, in case you're not aware, basically just means Japanese cuisine, Japanese food. That is what your average person on the street in Japan would tell you. They'd probably say nihon ryōri or something to that effect, and that just means Japanese cuisine. However, in the application to get this designated as Intangible Cultural Heritage of Japan, and because it was approved in 2013 in the actual designation according to UNESCO, washoku is not simply Japanese cuisine. It's actually this long, convoluted, and as you're going to hear us discuss in the conversation today, not accurate, but basically this is what UNESCO says that washoku is.
Social practice based on a comprehensive set of skills, knowledge, practice, and traditions related to the production, processing, preparation, and consumption of food. It is associated with an essential spirit of respect for nature, closely related to the sustainable use of natural resources. End of quote.
So you're going to get to hear us talk about why that's not accurate. And why it ended up being the way it is today. That is a lot of what Dr. Cwiertka's book, Branding Japanese Food, is about. However, there's another section in the book that actually explores food history in Japan. It goes back to the Edo period and looks at kind of, in a way, I guess you could say, the beginnings of modern day tourism in Japan and how some of the many things that are said to be famous in a certain region, right? Wherever you go in Japan, there's always some famous food or some famous sweet, right? And there's always a story behind this, right? Well, the fact of the matter is that a lot of times these stories are not based in fact, and they're actually based on dubious claims that go back at least to the Edo period. So that is the other part of what Dr. Cwiertka's book, Branding Japanese Food, discusses. We won't go too much into depth on that side of things because we're mainly going to focus on the UNESCO thing, which in and of itself, there's a lot to talk about. And it's, like I said, really interesting stuff. So hope you enjoy it. Here is my conversation with Dr. Katarzyna Cwiertka.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
I saw you, a few months ago in the lecture. I really found what you were talking about fascinating, and I thought I want to talk to you. And so, it took me a little while to read through the books that I was already reading, but I finally got to Branding Japanese Food.
Yeah, I know the problem about the book.
Yeah, it's a mountain of books, right?
Yeah,
but little by little. But fascinating stuff, and but it's a big topic, and there's a lot to
Cover, yes.
Yeah. So I thought maybe the best place to start would be with, could you explain kind of like what the intangible cultural heritage of UNESCO thing is, to give a little bit of context, and then we can jump into, the washoku side of things.
Yes. So the Convention of the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, as it is officially called, is a UNESCO treaty that was adopted in 2003. In order to protect and protect intangible cultural heritage around the world. So the convention entered into force in 2006, and from the following year we see the first entries being recorded on the list. And now I think that there are nearly 200 inscribed They call it elements on the list, and one of them is washoku. The officially recorded entry is washoku, traditional dietary cultures of the Japanese, notably for the celebration of New Year, which is a mouthful.
Actually, I was just watching a video on the UNESCO channel all about, especially they really emphasize the New Year's thing, but we'll get into that in just a moment. But just to give a little bit further example, like I was seeing, for example, things like kabuki, no theater, like those are all intangible cultural heritage, right?
Yes.
Designated by UNESCO. So basically, I guess the idea is, intangible in this case kind of means like non-physical items, because then you have like the actual UNESCO locations, right? Which there are a lot in Japan as well.
Yes.
But these are more like arts and kind of cultural sort of things, right?
Yes. And with things like theater, weaving practices, things are easy, right? But when with food-related entries, it becomes really like a Pandora box, because they are so much intertwined with commercial interests. And this is not only the problem with washoku that we have identified in our book, but all over the world. The food heritage is problematic because it generates profit. To a certain extent, of course, all UNESCO inscriptions have commercial connotations. For example, if a tourist site is a UNESCO heritage, it will obviously generate more tourists and be more well known. But in the case of food-related intangible heritage, it's a little bit more tricky.
So it was in 2013 that it was officially designated, right? But
yes.
I guess the application process takes a while. Like how long is that usually?
Well, the paperwork for the whole screening process for the intangible heritage entries, it takes approximately 20 months. So the entry can be submitted by a government or by a kind of group of governments. We have both examples of both. And in the case of washoku, it was the Japanese government that submitted the nomination at the end of February. And then it takes 20 months approximately. And then in the case of washoku, it was in December 2013 that it was officially inscribed. And the screening is necessary because the committee that consists of UNESCO bureaucrats has to ensure that the nominated element meets the criteria specified in the convention.
Okay. So like in the book and in the presentation that I watched that you gave, you explain a lot more about the application process, and a lot of the, like, it seems like they changed their mind partway through, and they started like marketing a whole different way, a whole different angle, and so there's a lot to kind of uncover there. But at what point did you see this and start thinking like, maybe I should start researching this, like what was it that kind of tipped you off that thought like there's more to this than what just the news reports are saying, like yay washoku, and like because that's what most of the news reports were saying at the time. It's like yay Japan washoku UNESCO, and like that was the end of the news story, right?
Yeah, and that's actually a very interesting point, because I have a student who she's an MA student from France, and she compared the media reports surrounding the French entry from 2010, the French gastronomic meal, and the Japanese accounts of the media accounts. And it is amazing to see how much more critical the French media were.
Really?
Yes. And actually the both nominations are very similar. And actually the Japanese, I know that from the informal conversations with people who are close to the nomination, that the French nomination was the model for the Japanese one. And it is interesting to see how absolutely uncritical the Japanese media was.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're the first person I've ever heard talk about anything beyond that, like what I said, like the sort of like yay, yay, hip, hip, hooray kind of thing, right? So
yes, and actually it was my interest was sparked first of all by the fact when I read the definition, and I thought, my God, I've been doing Japanese food history, for 20 years nearly. I started in the late 80s. And I've never seen this definition. What is this? And I started talking to people, to food scholars in Japan, and they were also perplexed. Well, yeah, this is, they would say, well, cuisine, strange. And then there is a very good friend of mine who is the co-author of the book. We started, chatting on Skype and complained about this ridiculous thing. And then during one of the conversations, we decided, what, we have to kind of do something about it. And that's when we started collaborating on the book in Japanese, first of all, to kind of dig in. And coming back to your original question, how did I uncover all this? I actually, the first thing I did was I went to the UNESCO website when you can download all kinds of documents. Among those documents is the collection, the PDF document with a collection of so-called in consent forms, where various individuals and organizations can kind of provide support for the nomination. And I started looking at this PDF document, basically looking for, okay, what kind of organizations have provide their support. And and that's a lot of documents. I think it's like more than 1,000 forms. And I was just scrolling through them, and then I just realized, wait a second, this is a different title. It's not saying washoku, it's saying something else. I have it here with me. It says distinctive Japanese cuisine with traditional features centered on kaiseki. So we have a completely, in a way, it is Japanese cuisine as well. So here there is a consistency here, but it's a very different angle, because kaiseki is a highly aestheticized meal produced by professional chefs, while washoku is being propagated and presented as a home-cooked meal, which is, as we indicate in the book, also historically inaccurate. But yeah, this struck me when I was looking at the documents, and we really became interested.
Right. So the original push in the documents, and I guess no, I mean, they were still there on the UNESCO website, but originally they were trying to get what you said, the kaiseki, or that longer designation, that longer title, I guess, something with kaiseki, was it?
Yes, distinctive Japanese cuisine with traditional features centered on kaiseki. And it's even more,
so long.
It's more complicated in Japanese, so let's leave it by that.
Yeah. So originally they were trying to get that registered, but partway through they gave up and said, let's go with washoku.
Yes, and that's really an interesting, quite a last-minute change that happened in November 2011. So it is just 4 months. They submitted the Washoku nomination in February next year, so it's only 4 months later. So I really have admiration for these people who are kind of, changing everything last minute. But actually the main reason for the change, for the switch, was the fact that the nomination by the South Korean government for the Korean royal cuisine, which was a restaurant and kind of refined cuisine as well, that was rejected. And the news about the rejection, official news, came a little bit later, but the members of the committee which was entrusted with putting together the nomination, the Japanese nomination, they heard the news already in November, and actually we can see that in the documents that all consent forms in this PDF documents from before, let's say, late November, early December, they are all for the kaiseki nomination, and for the starting from December onwards, January, they are all for washoku, which I to be honest, I don't really understand why they put them in, because everybody can go to the UNESCO website and download those forms. So I'm not sure if the people responsible for the documents thought, oh, nobody's going to look into those documents. They're in Japanese anyway. Yeah. So yeah, that was really puzzling for me.
Right. Okay, so then let's discuss like washoku. So, I guess I started learning Japanese in like the 90s, and I mean, it wasn't until I guess around that time, like the early 2010s, when you really start to hear more about washoku. But I mean, what I knew was that washoku is Japanese cuisine. Nihon ryōri is Japanese cuisine, and at best, I mean, or Japanese food. I mean, I guess you could translate it that way either way. But what was washoku? Like, could you explain a little bit about like what the common understanding of what washoku was until this, and then how exactly they tried to define washoku in this UNESCO application?
So I started.
It's a big question, I know.
Yeah, it's
so
a
I'm
big
sorry.
question. Well, but actually, it is a simple question. I remember when I started learning Japanese, right? You have those words that referred, and then I started writing my first thesis on the history of Japanese cuisine in 1989, which is already quite a long time ago. And then I started, learning the words and so forth. And I remember washoku always and nihon ryōri as a very general term, referring to, like, we have the concept of Japanese cuisine or Japanese food, right?
Yeah.
And this is how both words actually, washoku, if you look it up in the Japanese English dictionary, you will see that it's translated both washoku and nihon ryōri as a Japanese food or Japanese meal.
Yeah, I know, like something cuisine. Really common for Japanese learners is to ask their Japanese teacher, what's the difference? And then the Japanese teacher says, there's no real difference.
Yeah, and actually they are right, because there is no real difference. And the difference, I think, until the UNESCO nomination, the difference was very personal. So some people would consider one more appropriate for certain use than others. And actually we see we have, of course, we've done our homework and look up in the dictionaries, and the dictionaries, actually another surprising find was that the first mention of the washoku in a Japanese language dictionary is 1981, which is
super recent.
Super recent, right?
Yeah.
And let me see, I have it somewhere here.
Yeah.
So the first mention is 1981, and it defines washoku as, and I'm translating from Japanese, a Japanese style meal equal nihon ryōri. And then there is an entry for nihon ryōri also, and that explains the concept as dishes originally developed in Japan to meet its cultural climate, a general term for cuisine symbolizing the food commonly eaten by the Japanese people. Okay. So this is from 1981. So at this point, we see no difference either, right? There is no difference in the Japanese English dictionaries. There is basically no difference in the Japanese language dictionaries. For the first time, we found in 2002 edition of a dictionary which is called Ruigo Daijiten, where it says that Nihon Ryōri says it's high-quality Japanese dishes usually refers to high-quality, expensive dishes served at restaurants, which is probably, and that is 2002, right? It's the first time that I actually realized, okay, that we actually see the indication that Nihon Ryōri might mean more like restaurant food and washoku, home-cooked food. But it is not really spelled out. For the first time that it is really spelled out, washoku is the food of the common people cooked at home, it isn't even in the UNESCO nomination itself. It is in the all kinds of publicity, interviews and other publicity activities after or surrounding the 2013 inscription that we see repeatedly this connotation of washoku being home-cooked food, which is related, of course, to one of the requirements of the UNESCO Convention that the definition of heritage is actually also been criticized. How the UNESCO defines heritage was criticized by all kinds of heritage scholars. But one of the requirements is that it is not very exclusive thing, but actually a kind of, something by the people and for the people. And then it makes sense, once you know that, then it makes sense that they emphasize this very kind of popular democratic aspect of washoku in the nomination.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to like home cooking in Japanese, I mean, most people are just going to say like kate ryōri, right? Like home cooking, like literally home cooking or home food, I guess. I mean, when it comes, I guess they need to have that term to identify it as Japanese, but most people on a day-to-day basis aren't really saying washoku or using it much, right?
Well, the problem is, and this is why I think this was the reason why we have decided to write that book, is that as you mentioned, the Japanese were thrilled with the recognition by the UNESCO, and there was this whole tsunami of books about washoku and other activities propagating the inscription, that it has changed that the popular perception of what washoku is. As you mentioned, it was just kind of one of the words a kind of common noun, right? Japanese food. And it has become a brand name. It is now being used as a brand name in all kinds of activities for aiming at, for example, exports of sake. And it is interesting that the fact that it is easily pronounced by foreigners was actually one of the issues that are being mentioned in the minutes of in November, the committee for putting together the nomination for the UNESCO, the Japanese. The minutes are all available. I don't know if they are still available at the time when we are doing the research. They were still available online. So there you see a discussion between different members, and one of the people says, yeah, I don't actually understand what is the difference between washoku and nihon ryōri. So wouldn't it be confusing? And then another says, well, but it is, they use the word kikiyasui. So it is easy to the ear, and the foreigners can pronounce it. So it will be good for our branding purposes. And this is what I find most problematic, is that when you now Google washoku, the first and hits that will come will be related to the UNESCO heritage and the definition provided in the nomination, which is false in my view. And secondly, even when you go to encyclopedias, the online encyclopedias that are nowadays available, and my students wouldn't even bother to go and look up the paper version. They all use electronic encyclopedias.
Sure,
This is the same holds true for that. So when they look up washoku, the first thing that comes up is this nomination that was cooked up for the purpose of the UNESCO inscription, and is completely inconsistent with the historical facts.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about some of those inconsistencies. So as we said earlier, like, for example, I was watching one of those videos on the UNESCO page, on the UNESCO YouTube channel, and they were really emphasizing like the New Year's aspect of it. And I mean, really, like, the narration sounded like a Japanese person had written it and they had just translated that. It starts with, Japan is a place with many topographical features and 4 seasons. It's like, okay, many countries have 4 seasons. Many countries have topographical features. Like, there's nothing unique about that. But anyway, and New Year's, and then they throw in kaiseki, but then they also throw in home cooking. So it seems like they're just throwing everything, but they're also trying to make it sound like it's really, really unique. And to me, it seems like, I don't know. It seems like I don't even know how to put it. Like, they're trying everything, but at the same time, they're trying to make it sound like it's the only thing in the world. Like, there's nothing else like Japanese food. So that's kind of the impression that I got from some of the material that I was looking at.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I completely understand your feeling. And maybe I can quote a fragment from the definition, which sparked my... So according to this definition provided in a nomination filed by the Japanese government, washoku is, and then I quote, social practice based on a comprehensive set of skills, knowledge, practice, and traditions related to the production, processing, preparation, and consumption of food. It is associated with an essential spirit of respect for nature, closely related to the sustainable use of natural resources. End of quote. And then, I quite often I ask my students as an exercise to read the nomination part of it and then tell me what washoku is. And their response is, it's so confusing and vague. And then I said, yes, well done, exercise completed. Because this is just, what is interesting is that this emphasis on social practice and skills, it clearly is used to tick all the boxes of the screening. And I can imagine that they already had, so from November to February, they have to refurbish the whole thing. And what is interesting that they basically, the content of a nomination is similar to what they had before, with the kaiseki as its core. And then they try to kind of refurbish it to tick all the boxes. And that's why you get this kind of very strange combination of practically everything.
Yeah. Like, at best, like if I had to come up with a Japanese term to describe that description, I would say nihon no shokubunka, like the food culture of Japan, because people are not in Japanese. When you're speaking Japanese, the average person is not using washoku to mean what you just said.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, Nihon no shokubunka. And actually, in the earlier drafts, because this kind of endeavor, of course, takes years of planning, right? And in an earlier pamphlets, I have seen actually Nihon no shokubunka, or the Japanese food culture, as one of the suggestions.
Yeah.
And I think that by using washoku, they have actually opened Pandora box. But if they would have presented the same nomination but called it Japanese food culture or something like that, our book wouldn't probably be written at all.
Yeah.
It would be still problematic.
Sure. Yeah. I agree. Yes, it would be.
But the fact that washoku is a word, one of those words, there are many of them, that was created during the late 19th century, right? When the Japanese culture was undergoing westernization. So all kinds of non-Western material objects were flooding Japan, right? And spreading, like the Western style suits and hats. And among other things, also Western style food was becoming more and more popular. So that was, and then we see the word yoshoku, Western style food,
right,
coming into fashion, right? Lots of Western style restaurants serving kind of strange Japanese
kind of versions of
the there's even the term yoshokuya, so the restaurant serving Western style food, that this word becomes really kind of comes into common use you use in the early 20th century. And then this is washoku actually is created in order to kind of as a kind of counter
to define what the other is, in a way,
what the other is. So we have yoshoku, which came from abroad, and at that point yoshoku was the most popular foreign food. What at that point in history, the Chinese food was not that popular. Chinese food becomes popular only from the 1930s onwards. So we see the yoshoku, which is the food that the new one. So how do we call what we had? And then the word washoku becomes is created, and it's actually not the only term that used to be that we found in the newspaper, our newspaper analysis. So there were other terms such as nihon ryōri, but also nihon shoku was another one.
Nihon shoku.
Nihon fu no ryōri.
Fu no ryōri, that's a very interesting one.
And actually, Nihon fu no ryōri was featured in the very first mention of the term. Well, it's becoming complicated because when we did what we tried to do, we tried to kind of look into historical sources to find out, what was the meaning of washoku? When we saw this very weird definition in the nomination, we tried to look at the historical use of the word since its inception in the 19th century. And we have a great tool to our disposal, which is the database of Japanese newspapers, which are now searchable. Otherwise, it would have been a lifetime thing. But now we can search in a database. So what we did, we took the Yomiuri Shimbun and Asahi Shimbun databases, and we looked into all the washoku instances for the period of 100 years, roughly. And the very first, and the tricky thing is that the databases from 1989, they are electronic, right? The newspapers are available electronically. But before 1989, what happened that the people who created the database, they would scan the paper newspapers, right? And then manually that they would. It was I actually talked to people from Yomiuri and Asahi who were responsible for the database, and he said, well, we basically what we did, there was a team of people who were looking at all the articles and assigning the keywords manually to the scanned text. So when we looked with keywords for washoku, the first one that popped up was in Yomiuri Shimbun was in 1881, was something actually related to the Hawaiian king.
Oh, yeah. I remember in the book, David Kalakaua, right?
Yeah, Hawaiian king. He was visiting Japan at the time, and the Yomiuri Shimbun, among other things that they report that he watched a public performance at the theater, and visited the Shiba Park, and among other things, they'll say he will try Japanese food, and that was the washoku keyword. But then when we went to the original text in the newspaper, it says Nihon fu no ryōri. It doesn't say washoku.
That's so confusing, complicated. Why?
Yeah, it's complicated. Well, but I can imagine that the people, when they it is a hell of a job, I can imagine, of course. And then they, and that actually supports our claim that washoku was a word used to, in very general sense, to refer to Japanese food. But that was interesting to see also. There is another term that comes in the sources, which is called honpo ryōri, which means our country's food.
Oh, wow.
So we see at the time that there are all kinds of words that are created in order to, reflect the situation that there is another yoshoku or seiyo ryōri on the stage. But they are used interchangeably. There is no difference in the use. So the in restaurant advertisements, they would use nihon ryōri or washoku, depending. It was really, there was no pattern we could find there.
And what's interesting is that everything you're describing, no matter what the term, to me, what I get is that you are describing the food that is being eaten. You're not describing the fact that they are pounding mochi, like in the New Year's example, or the fact that the food is served in multiple little dishes, or any of these more like or in the video that I was watching, like the older generation teaching the younger generation about the significance of each little dish. Like none of that is in that kind of practical day-to-day usage of these terms, right?
No. And what is even more interesting, that we have this New Year, even the New Year dishes feature prominently, right, in the nomination and in the video, in the activities propagating washoku after the inscription, New Year disappears. It's nowhere to be found, really, and it's really so interesting. One of the first events that was organized after the inscription, I think it was a week after December 2013, was something which was called washoku do. And do, as you know, is this do michi, is this character which appears in judo.
Right. Yeah.
Sado.
Yeah. Tons. Aikido.
Aikido. So it's
Bushido. Tons.
So it implies something very like traditional pursuit, right? So by
like a practice, basically.
Practice.
Right?
Yes, exactly. So it was amazing when I saw washoku do, and actually this event was competition for professional chefs. So how much more complicated can it get? So you propagate Japanese food as as washoku as a home cooked food, and then 1 week later, while telling your audience that this is a home cooked food, you have a washokudo, a new word actually, designated as a kind of title for the competition for professional chefs from abroad competing in the actually kind of kaiseki type of cuisine, right? So this is just madness, and I really, one of the reasons why we wanted to write the book is there is practically zero, maybe some, nowadays there are some voices of criticism raised by the academic community in Japan. But at the time, there was no single academic. There are lots of academics in Japan who deal with food history. Nobody has raised the voice saying, guys, this is a little bit too far. And that was really very disappointing. I've been doing Japanese food history since the 90s, and I know a lot of people in Japan who I really, had lots of respect about their scholarship, but they remained silent, and that was really very disappointing to me.
I mean, the impression that I get, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but on a day-to-day basis, people in Japan, they might use washoku, but they're basically using it to refer to the food. It really seems like this whole other aspect of washoku is basically a marketing tool, and it's being used to reach people outside of Japan. I mean, is that accurate, would you say?
I would say...
Or is that an oversimplification?
Well, I think that there are two coins of the two sides of the coin. Yeah. I think that is the soft power of that, right? Japan branding is a very important aspect of it. But what has also been emphasized we haven't looked into it, but emphasized by other scholars who looked into washoku story, is that it was also a way to support something that you might know, the shokuiku, so the food education campaign in Japan.
Oh, okay.
There is another kind of effort by the Japanese government to have Japanese eat more Japanese food,
right?
Because of the food self-sufficiency problem, right? So because Japanese eat so much non-Western food. Non-Japanese food. Yes, import, exactly. Imports. There is a rice problem, the rice surplus problem. So the Japanese government has been trying for several years now to tackle a food self-sufficiency problem, and shokuiko is one of the strategies to teach young people more about local food. And there is nothing wrong about that. Again, as a historian, I caution people to, you can teach about local food, but only if it's not invented for the very purpose. And what we see now is this is another protagonist of our book are the omiyage and Meibutsu, so the food souvenirs. They are very often simply manufactured for the branding purposes.
Yeah, I mean that's another fascinating aspect of the book. We can't go too deep into that, but
exactly.
I do just want to let the listeners know that I think that in the what is taught to people learning kind of introductory Japanese history is, in the Edo period, people were not traveling and people were just kind of really, really restricted. And yes, of course, there was that, but there was traveling going on, right? And this kind of sparked some of this beginnings of what would become, this massive domestic tourism industry in Japan, where every single place has some famous souvenir, some famous food, some famous thing, and they're always trying to get you to buy it, right?
Yes, and that's really fantastic. I love this side of Japan, right? It's fantastic.
Yeah,
but
it's fun. It's fun.
Yeah,
too.
it's fun. But when you start digging, it is clear that it is manufactured for the branding purposes.
Yeah, and it was manufactured, like some of it at least was back in the Edo period. They were already starting to find ways to market things even if it wasn't historically accurate,
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. But the interesting thing is that because it is included in some old, the travel book, travelogue, or travel guide, it is now being used by shops that sell it as a kind of proof that this is authentic food. While when you look deeper, it is actually been manufactured in the Edo period as well by the authors of those guidebooks to make them more attractive. This is really a fascinating story. For me, it was also a journey into something that I didn't know about.
Yeah. No, I really like that part of the book too. There's so much there that, I mean, you don't normally get to hear about, like, tied with, for example, like, art from the time and woodblock prints, and it all just kind of comes together because a lot of those things were like kind of travel, almost like travel postcards in a way, right? Like you're getting to see scenic landscapes from certain parts of the country that maybe a person would go visit and they buy and they take that back. And so it's really interesting stuff, but...
Yeah, it was very interesting. I think it's for every author that when you write a book, it is a learning experience for yourself.
Sure, yeah.
But for me, it kind of, everything I knew about Japan throughout my career, it kind of fell into place. Okay, now I get it. Yeah.
So one last area, but I want to ask you, so when you're speaking to Japanese people and speaking Japanese, what do you normally use? Washoku, nihon ryōri, what do you say if that sort of situation comes up?
Well, it's for me, the word washoku is tainted now. So I have become very careful what I use. So, for example, when we go to a kaiseki restaurant, I prefer to call it kaiseki, right? But it has become such a heavy term for me that I actually kind of I
try to avoid it.
Try to avoid it. And I actually prohibited my husband to use the word in the house. He's not allowed to use it in the house.
You just have to say like the dish that you're eating, right?
Yeah, exactly. Be specific. Be specific.
Yeah.
I like sashimi. I like sashimi.
Exactly. It's after you hear like the whole presentation, you read the book, you go like, okay. You really start to think about like what you should be saying, and like every time that. Yeah, like when I was just kind of looking up, I was trying to go back and see what people were saying about 2013, like back when this all happened. And without any effort at all, I was finding tons of articles, just type in washoku and you get like just about everything from 2013 when that was happening. So that has become so prevalent. So I think part of the reason why I wanted to have you on is because I want people to know that it's not as simple as the complicated mess that they put out.
Well, but actually, I think that when you start digging the history, it becomes so fascinating.
Yeah,
I think that the fact that that the word comes up, it kind of is given birth to, right, and then it has all these avenues of use, and then it ends up as a heritage. Is a kind of fantastic. I think it's a terrific story to tell.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So of course, links in the show notes for the book. I highly recommend, especially there's so much more that we couldn't get to in the Edo period side of things. And that's a great aspect of the story. But thank you so much for making time to talk. I loved getting to share this story with the listeners. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk about, your own baby, right? So it was a pleasure.
I just want to mention really quickly that it was an utter delight to get to talk to Dr. Cwiertka, not just because she was really fun to talk to, but also because what we talked about was basically the perfect intersection between linguistics, language history, and food. I love Japanese food. I love talking about it. I love eating it. And I love digging into language and why things mean what they mean and etymologies and all that stuff. So thank you so much, Dr. Cwiertka, for coming on the show. If you want to learn more about what we discussed, especially the topic of tourism and marketing in Edo period Japan, go pick up a copy of Branding Japanese Food from Meibutsu to Washoku. You can use the Amazon affiliate link in the show notes, japanstationpodcast.com, to check out the full version of the show notes. And if you want to just go straight to Amazon and do your shopping, then use japankyo.com/Amazon. Anything you pick up there is going to support the show, and it won't cost you anything extra. If you have any questions or comments, send them over to mail@japanstationpodcast.com. Remember to subscribe. That is the number one free thing you can do to support the show. And of course, rate and review. I certainly appreciate that. And follow on Facebook and Twitter @JapanKyo News. Of course, thank you to Unomi for providing the opening and closing song, Oedo Controller. And that does it for this episode. Episode 64 is coming April 15th. I've got a couple of interviews lined up, which I should be doing very soon, so I won't say which episode will be released on the 15th, but either way, it's going to be a good one. And of course, don't forget to check out Ichimon Japan. The latest episode is all about bubble era Japan. We talk all about slang from bubble era Japan, which is late 1980s, early 1990s, fashion trends, and fake antennas and glitter and beer and a whole bunch of other stuff. So go check out Ichimon Japan, episode 39. All right. Thank you for listening. And remember, go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!